Tango 1 at the top, we are at Pop-Up Vehicle. 10-4, Tango 1, you have control. Tango 1 copy. Stand by. Stand by.
Integrity, passion, resilience. That's what this place was built on. That's what our community is founded on. Don't act like the example, just be the example. This is the home of the greatest fitness community in the world. We're trying to create strong, able bodies, resilient to injury with a gas tank to get shit done. If there's one thing from this podcast, it's about taking immediate action. Find the problem, fix the problem. This is your opportunity. It's either a hell yes or a fuck no. It's that simple.
You're ruining the Tango 1 podcast.
Now is the time to take action. Now's the time to do more and be more.
Welcome to the Tango 1 podcast. I am Tony Smith, a retired cop and SWAT team leader. Currently the owner and the founder of the Garage Gym and Tango 1 Solutions. Joined every week, every episode by my friend, also Garage Gym trainer, fireman and an amateur stuntman, Casey Wright. Our mission every week is to challenge you and guide you to create an immediate action plan against your problems and weaknesses. Simply put, we want you to do more and be more. Today, we are welcoming Irene Moore Davis. Irene was born in Windsor, Ontario. She's an educator, a historian, and an author. She's an activist who frequently speaks about equity, diversity, and African Canadian history to a wide variety of audiences. She fulfills a variety of community roles, including the president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. She's the co-chair of the Black Women of Forward Action, programming chair at the Bookfest Windsor, and co-host of All Right in Sin City podcast. Irene is also involved in the Buxton National Historic Site and Museum, Women Inspiring Action, Sister to Sister, Think Wise, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Sorority Incorporated, and her faith community. She spent 6 years on the board of the Windsor and District Black Coalition. Irene's forthcoming book is titled Our Own Two Hands, A History of Black Lives in Windsor from the 1700s forward. In her personal life, Irene is an administrator at St. Clair College, where she also teaches Underground Railroad history. She's a graduate of the University of Windsor, Queen's University, and Western University, making, as we just talked about how I have no universities, seem even more. Irene resides in Windsor with her husband, Rodney. So it is great to have you on, and that is quite the resume. Sorry if I butchered some of those. They're flying out there.
There was no butchering, and thanks for having me.
This is awesome. So week in, week out, we try to bring in guests from our network, from my network, from Casey's network, who are going to motivate people to take action. So today we decided to go outside of our network and bring in somebody to motivate me to take action, and Casey and everybody who listens to this. So we want to talk about racism today. We want to talk about equity issues. The focus of this, the overview is really, it's not about the George Floyd, but it's about what was stemmed from George Floyd. I think there's being a cop and a use of force instructor. This is maybe the first case like this that I haven't heard one person say, well, this could have been what was going through their heads. It's disgusting, it's wrong, and I think we can kind of move forward from that. But, good comes out of bad, and I think it's stemmed a lot of conversations I've never had. One I never thought we'd be having on this podcast, so I'm really looking forward to listening to you. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so right away, let's start with a little bit of uncomfortable things. So for me, we're having a talk the other day in my garage, and we're about how we were going to support and how we're going to vocalize our support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I realized I didn't even know what's the proper way to refer to Black people. Is it African Canadian? Is it the Black community? We don't even know these things, and this is kind of where I'm like, oh my god, I'm learning so much stuff lately that I never even thought of, and things that maybe I'm saying not maliciously, but it might be offending people. So what's proper?
Sure. I mean, there are multiple terminologies that are okay. People of African descent in Canada are usually comfortable with being called African Canadian or Black Canadian, and it's fine. What we do not like is being called African American, which happens a lot because we are Canadian. But also you'll see references to Black/African/Caribbean communities, because often in places like Windsor, those are three very distinctive identities, and people really feel that they are Caribbean Canadians or Canadians from the continent of Africa, and they may not want to be lumped in with all of the others. But I mean, generally when you're speaking, in an overview kind of way, Black Canadian or African Canadian is fine.
Right, okay, thank you. I think people don't know what you said there too. There is so many African, African like the Sudanese, the Ethiopians, Somalis. There's so many like African countries that are here, and like big communities. The Sudanese in particular is one that I think of because I dealt with a lot in the West
the Nigerian community for sure.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on. I always feel like, am I lumping one in if I say African, like Canadian, or it just doesn't? It's all good.
Both of those terms are okay.
Okay, cool, good. I won't offend you going further then. Making sure, good, off for a good start. So today I really would love to here you wanted to talk about some diversity things. I'd love for you to just kind of throw it at us and what you think we could do to be better around here and what the actual state of affairs are. I think with the social media and the news, we're really getting locked in a lot with the states. And I do want to hopefully tell people, I know racism is here and policing has its problems, but I can assure you that it might be a little bit further on that side of the border. And I would love to focus here because I think we can't fix anything if we don't start right within Casey and I and our own families and then our own little communities and then go from there, build out. So
that's exactly right.
Fill us in. What do you think? What's the state of race relations in Windsor, Essex right now?
I would say that overwhelmingly it's good, but there are problems, and this is an opportunity to fix them. I mean, there is a lot of conversation, as you've said. People are sort of applying that lens to everything nowadays because of what's happened in America, but also because of some pretty high-profile cases here in Canada, not necessarily right here, but in Toronto and elsewhere. In terms of recent things that have occurred with respect to police mental health checks on some people of color and Indigenous people that went terribly wrong. There are those conversations going on too that may not be picked up by the press quite as much as the big George Floyd case, for example, or the Ahmaud Marbury case, which of course have garnered world attention. So I mean, here in Windsor, I would say that generally speaking, people of African descent, African Canadians, Black Canadians, feel as though things are better here than in the US, but there are still a lot of issues. There is a continuing problem in terms of unemployment and underemployment of people of color who have the same credentials as others who are not getting anywhere near the same kind of opportunities. There are still issues in terms of some racially biased policing, unfortunately. Not as widespread as it used to be, but there are still incidents that come up, and that's unfortunate. And we're certainly very concerned as a community about just sort of the state of diversity in workplaces generally, especially in those public sector workplaces where we all feel that we have an equal stake in paying these salaries and things. We do want to see more diversity in those areas and really everywhere. And we continue to have concerns about the education system. Even now, leaders in our community and people in our community hear constantly about kids of African descent who are dissuaded from going into academic subjects, even though they have the aptitude and the skills to do so, just because there's this perception that maybe it's not for them, maybe it'll be too hard. We hear about uneven discipline handed out in schools for very similar infractions. We hear about just sort of students feeling alienated from the education system and that they go entirely K to 12 without seeing a teacher who isn't white. I mean, all of those things need to be addressed too.
Right. So the role, the teachers is predominantly white, right? Okay. I mean, as are police officers.
Yeah.
And what is the population in Windsor, Essex County? Do you know, percentage-wise?
I don't know percentage-wise, and I'm not that great in math, but I do know in the latest census figures, there were about 9,000 people of African descent who self-identified as such in the Windsor Census CMA.
Okay. I was curious. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to mention just the way, I think the big thing, even just hearing you talk through that first bit is just it's education kind of all around the board, right? A lot of the stuff's unknown. I'm naive to it a lot. And it's not that, it's just stuff I don't always look into, right? And so hearing some of those stats and some of those things, and you don't think, again, that it is as prevalent as it is, it does exist.
Oh, sure.
Right? And so I'm happy to be in this conversation because I'm very interested to learn these things and be able to kind of expand that perspective with everything.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have to be educated about these things. And I mean, all of us as allies to other populations have to do all that we can to learn. There are other minority groups or other groups that are marginalized that I don't belong to. And I need to do my part to find out what's happening with Indigenous people in this country, for example. So we all have to do that if we want to make a better Canada.
Yeah, the Indigenous side would be a whole... that'd be a whole 10, 20, 50 podcasts. I mean, that problem, what we've done to that population is, if you really look at it,
It's prevalent.
It's
there.
it's as bad as slavery, in my opinion.
It's really bad.
Of the South that happened. So with the children, I think it's important. Like, it's not the teachers. Most of them genuinely care. I would believe so.
Of course they
and
do.
I don't think that people, especially on our audience and living in Windsor, Essex County, a lot of people like me who grew up, privileged, let's say, in predominantly white schools. And, I grew up in LaSalle. I was born in the West End, for all that matters. But one moved into he's from the Sioux, where, not a lot of...
It's very, like, it's
minorities.
Predominantly 95% white and Italian, right? So it's...
I don't think people realize that there are schools downtown where I would go in teaching VIP at a school right in downtown Queen Victoria for, I think, 12 years of my career there. And there was I don't know if there was 2 kids in the class that parents were born in Canada.
Right.
And they're starting at a significant, not to mention that, we always say the 60s was when the kind of like, the catch up with everybody else term that people keep using. Like, so now you've got the racism that held everybody back so much, or the actual oppression, not the racism, I guess would be the proper word, right? And then you've got the coming from another country, and what can we do? Like, how can we help as a community that doesn't live maybe actually in that environment?
I mean, I think it's about breaking down the barriers that exist in terms of all of us living in our little neighborhoods and our little suburbs, and being willing to go in, volunteer, being willing to provide support in whatever way we can, reaching out to the schools, finding out what it is that they would find helpful, reaching out to those ethnocultural communities, finding out what they would find helpful. I don't come from downtown Windsor either, and I don't really come from an immigrant community, so it's not so much for me to say, but I think that it's always about listening and dialogue and exploring and not assuming, but asking, what would you find helpful? What do you need? What would be helpful support from the rest of us? I know that the teachers, certainly throughout all of the 4 school boards and probably the private schools, they are primarily conscientious, wonderful people. They're doing their best. They're often working way beyond their job descriptions and working really hard, and administrators are too. But the pressures that sometimes they're under kind of force some prioritization to occur. And it's all too easy for kids that come from English as a second language backgrounds, or that don't have the established networks here in the community, to fall behind and to have fewer opportunities to experience more bullying and more difficulty that way. And we all have to really play our role. I think in terms of the kids of African descent specifically throughout the school system, some of the things that they're encountering are just not internalized, just sort of the pervasive racism that exists in every person that's come up in North American culture. And that affects Black people too. It's like, if you've grown up in this culture, then you've been accustomed to images and stereotypes that make it very, very easy to succumb to these thoughts that people of African descent are less academically inclined, are more likely to be violent, are more dangerous, are not as hardworking or whatever, just based on what's in media, based on what you're constantly absorbing. So it's a daily practice that we have to engage in to shed those kinds of stereotypes. And unfortunately, in a school setting, especially when teachers and administrators are under a lot of pressure, there's often a situation in which they're just sort of reacting to situations, assuming that the Black kid did it, assuming that the Black kid is not going to progress to university. Even if they're not articulating that, these are assumptions that can really have a long-term effect on these kids and their whole lives. So we all have to work against that constantly. And one of the things I really think we need to do is engage in anti-racism training for every teacher in the school system. Just, they're not overtly racist. They're not trying to do those things. These are just assumptions that are deeply embedded that we have to all work on.
Yeah, I think that's where the most kind of gray area comes in, is because a lot of it's not known to them that they're doing it. They're not doing it consciously, like you say, where a lot of teachers, especially who are overworked, right? And unfortunately, you do fall back to stereotypes and things you learned however many years ago, whether they're true or not. But when you're kind of under those pressures, if that's the first thing that comes to mind, and then now you don't have the opportunity, or you're not taking those extra steps to further that education, or if that education is not available to you. And I think that's a big thing, is it's not like you don't have really a mandatory class generated on it.
No.
And then whether you mean to or not, you're naive to a lot of the decisions you're making, and that's where issues lie, because a lot of people are good people, but they don't know that what they're doing is hurting someone else.
Absolutely. They just don't see it. I mean, we all have blind spots. And for sure, I would say anti-racism is different from just multiculturalism and diversity. And a lot of teachers, excellent teachers, and people in other professions have come up in an environment where we value everybody's culture. We want to do potlucks with everybody's food. We want to see everybody wear the costumes and dance to their music. And that's all beautiful and joyous, but that's not addressing the core issue of, am I treating somebody differently without even meaning to treat somebody differently?
You want to dance to this music, eat that food, but yet when you go travel, you won't leave your resort.
Right.
You know, there's some things that I've been kind of like getting me fired up when I'm listening to some people, my friends really, and me, I know it's in me, is that, you know, you want all these things, you're telling us all to do all these things, but yet you won't leave a resort where you have no problem throwing up a $10 bill to make sure the bartender in Mexico takes care of you for a whole week. Like I
Yes.
feel like there's a lot of things that we need to correct in our own households, and that's the first step I'm trying to do, is realizing, you know, we had an Asian friend over and we had made a joke about driving, and you know, he never said anything, and we laughed because we're all good friends. And then, you know, when we had this conversation about how we were going to address this thing, he's like, you know, guys, like, just so you know, like, when you say that, like, I know you're joking, but like, I take it all the time, and it's like, well, and if my kids hear me say it, well, now they're going to make that joke because they don't know.
Oh, for
so
sure.
like, what can we do other than, you know, trying to cut off words like that? How can I educate my children so that they don't become part of this cycle?
I think the role modeling is the most important thing. We have to be intentional about what we're saying, what we're thinking, what we're doing. And I have to say, it's not even people that go to resorts. I mean, think about how friends and coworkers talk when they go to the States to shop. Like,
Yes.
Look at that. You know, you want to get on the expressway and head straight to Meyer. You don't want any of those people near you.
Yeah, lock the doors, don't stop.
Right?
Lock the doors, don't stop. Like, that's
So
the constant, right?
how many times do kids hear all of us say that stuff? So, I mean, those are the things we have to pay attention to as well, our own behaviors. And I mean, I know no one around this table is a racist. I mean, very few of the people I've ever known are actually overtly racist. But we can all very easily be guilty of those kinds of behaviors that just perpetuate a system that results in repercussions that we can't imagine. Somebody not making it to university when they should have been a doctor, but they're sweeping floors. Somebody feeling really disengaged from the school system because of the number of times they've been accused of something or suspended or whatever unfairly when other kids did the same stuff and nothing happened. The number of times that complaints go forward, you know, in a workplace or whatever, and people just feel like there's no point in even engaging with that system. So, I mean, we have to all understand that whatever we do kind of ripples. There's a ripple effect from whatever we do or say.
Yeah, I have a few very good friends that are police officers and are African Canadian, and they were one of my first concerns when all this happened, because I feel like those guys, great guys, totally there to back up another officer, but also part of, you know, your community. And like, I feel like I was worried that those guys would feel like they don't have a place on either side of that line, and really there should be no line, but there's a line. There's
Sure
a line
is.
right now, and the line is getting drawn.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I mean, we can start to erase it, but it's getting between the police and the community. And I know that 99% of the police officers do not want this to be the problem. Like,
course.
they don't want that to be the image that they're portraying. And so with those guys, it was the first time I realized it was like, man, like, we had seen a few guys have been called Uncle Tom and, you know, those kinds of words, but then we would do coffee runs, and it was the junior guy, and so there's a junior guy, and he happened to be black, and he goes to get coffee for all of us. And this particular place, back in those days too, it was very common to get free coffee, and you'd leave a very handsome tip, so nobody gets in trouble there, but you'd leave a tip. But we would go, you know, all the time, and they would rotate the 4 junior guys, 3 of them being white. Coffee's free, coffee's free, coffee's free, coffee's not free.
Oh.
And it was like, I mean, we're getting free coffee, you can't complain, but at the same time, and then it was like, oh, it's just a coincidence, just a different person. And then, you know, the next time he was up again, it wasn't free again. And then you start to realize that, man, these things, like, I don't think happen in the world because I don't have a black face, right? And like, he's probably experiencing all the time. You start to have that different feel about it, and that's what we need to, like, I don't know, improve at some point. So like, this is where I want to go. So with the police officers, I think one of my holdups is I'm not there anymore, but I was there for a very long time, and I worked I worked all 18 years on the street, which is something I'm very proud of. I started in the West End. I went to SWAT, where we were working all, the lower income neighborhoods, where we're getting a lot of the complaints and a lot of the problems were happening, the crime. And then I went back to the West End. Well, the West End is a special place, though. The West, like there's a relationship with the community there, and it's always been a place where cops want to go, that want to get their hands dirty and fighting crime, but also be immersed in the community. And I know we were talking with John Elliott before that in the Stag, and that's the guys that I was raised by, and it's where my father worked a great deal of his career. But what I'm saying is, I don't know that the police are as much of the problem as the oppression and the systemic and systematic. I don't know what the right term is. When you're going into the neighborhood as a white cop, or as a cop in general, I guess it didn't matter if you're black or white as a cop, you're going into the neighborhood, legitimately, like, a lot of those people hate me without knowing, right? And you're not going to the good people's houses, you're going to the same bad people's houses all the time. And there's a body in that uniform, and it is becoming trained in you. Like, so I don't know how to say this, and I'm not even going to try to be politically correct. Like, there's the war, people come back from war, right? And they, there's guys I know that will not go eat at a Middle Eastern restaurant.
Sure.
So now when you go into a room and they're saying, like, more likely to have use of force, white on black, and all these things, like, I think it's legit. And I think it's something that's so much bigger than just fixing, like, making sure we're hiring better and training better. I think there needs to be some decompression of these police officers. I think there needs to be some immersion into these neighborhoods so they can talk to the people. Like, there's so many great people that are, African Canadian.
Sure.
But as a cop, you don't go into the white people's houses that are good people either. You go to the bad people's house all the time for 18 years for me. That like wears on your heart.
Of course.
Like, what can we do to train, or to, I don't know, any kind of,
I think again it's community dialogue. I know that resources are always limited. It's hard to find the money to pay officers to be sitting around tables with people and having dialogue, but that's essentially where it starts. And I think it's also partly having a diverse workforce too. If you are constantly in a car with nothing but people who look by yourselves, and you're only around people that look like yourself, and you've got a workforce of, let's say, a little over 600, and there's like 13 black staff, the chances of you having that regular immersion in the culture just through your coworkers and colleagues is really, really limited. And I think that's a piece of it as well. But just engaging in those practices of dialogue are so important. I think that what's funny is, and I'm not going to name his name, but there is a great officer who spends a lot of his time in the West End of Windsor, and who's kind of sent out to all the community functions with black people, but he is a black person. And that's nice in a way, in terms of the kids seeing a role model who looks like them and realizing that they could have this career, and that police sometimes do look like them and do come from the community. But it also, I think, robs other police of the opportunity to engage in those situations too, and to learn from them. And I think that maybe it needs to be a more rotating kind of situation, kind of like your coffee runs.
And do you think that kind of can stem with young kids, as being like, if the black cop's coming into our neighborhood and it's a familiar face and this is what we have, now when there's a problem and it's a white cop coming in, do you think that kind of ingrains in them that this isn't the guy that I always feel safe around, who's coming to our community, like barbecues and things like that? Is that who, now it's someone different, an unfamiliar face?
It could
and does
be
that
some
play
of
into it as well?
You know what? I've never examined that or thought about it, but there could be some of that as well. Because I will tell you, at a lot of these kinds of events, when we see the white officers, they're in their dress uniform, and they're wearing their hats, and they're looking like authority figures. And even though they have friendly faces, they are dressing the part of someone that you're not going to get cozy with. So, these are all things to consider, and I appreciate that point very much.
So when we talk about defunding police, I think people really, and myself included, when I first heard that, I'm like, what are you talking about? But we're not talking about debunking the police. We're not talking about taking them all out. And I think one thing that we're talking about, you can't pay guys to just sit around a round table. And I don't think it has to be around a round table, because I also don't think that, a 15-year-old kid who's not sure which way he's going to go in life, that's where he's going to want to do either. I think with the defunding, it's moving money around in the police service, or outside of the police service. If there was better ways to deal with the mental illness, better ways to deal with all kinds of these like the police officers have become almost like insurance agents. You're taking reports, you're a secretary, you're not really doing police work, which the first foundation of any police work should be visibility, right? Crime prevention and community policing.
Yeah.
And because at the end, and that's one of the reasons I'm no longer there, I wasn't a cop anymore. I was a report taker. I would go and there was no time in between. Like the days of when I started, and you'd get out of your police car at a basketball court at the Stag, or at any kind of the festivals or anything, and walk around and talk to people, or go into a store and actually talk to the store owners. Like, it just doesn't happen anymore because it cannot happen because there's no time for it. So if we were able to defund in terms of moving money around, and whether that's the proper word or not, I think we can make a really big difference. And I'm talking like I'm still a cop, but I think they can make a really big difference and take some huge step forwards with not just the Black community, but the whole community. Because in Windsor, I feel like if you were to count my arrests, I don't know, I feel like it would be 30% Black people, 30% white people, 30% Middle Eastern, and then probably 10% other. And like, it's not like where you're going to the States and you're getting neighborhoods that are 95%. Right. So I think we could really make a difference. I just don't know how you would ever do it, and then how do these people safely go and deal with mental illness if you're not a police officer and you're not carrying some kind of use of force, because unfortunately, you do have to go hands-on a lot.
Oh, sure you do. And I mean, when people are in a heightened state and they're experiencing paranoia and whatever they're going through, they can become quite violent, of course. But multifunctional teams are a really great model that have been tried out in other cities, and I would love to see more of that here.
Can you explain that just a little bit?
Well, I mean, as opposed to just sending out police officers on their own, police officers are highly trained, highly skilled, very well educated, especially in this municipality, in Windsor, where I'm from. But they're not social service workers, and they're not psychologists, and they're not nurses. Like, they're not those things. If you have access to people from different professions, from a multidisciplinary background, who can go out and handle these purely mental health wellness check kind of situations, or situations where someone is acting in ways that people consider threatening because of their mental illness, it would, I think, make a big difference. It would reduce the amount of time for police to be spending on these things, and perhaps allow for better intervention. We have so many people, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but we have so many people that are in the criminal justice system basically because of their ongoing mental health issues.
Oh,
and,
yes.
if they could be managed in a different way and assisted in a different way, like think of, not just in terms of police spending, but how much less would it cost us in terms of our jails and our prison system and all of that stuff?
The ER is just, it's full, and it just doesn't seem a solution, and it's really depleting on the resources. It's wearing people out. It's wearing out nurses, and now when you go to deal with somebody else, the stress level is so high.
Of course it is.
From the whole day, from the whole week, and then now you get a little pushback on something, and that's where people are going to lose their temper, and that's where you see those really negative interactions come out. And many of the videos we've seen before is scared. That's when I look at those videos, I'm seeing somebody who is scared. Like, they're very educated, most police officers, but we've also kind of gotten away from getting police officers who have played sports, or who like me, who maybe didn't get educated, who I was part of the AKO fratman football, and in that locker room I was the minority, which was like the only time in 3 years of my life, right? Like,
wow.
So you learn some things a little bit differently, and I think that's where a lot of these problems are coming, is from this like fear, from the overworked, and from the stress. And then when you have your ability, you have this great power, and if you've never been one who's been in charge of anything in your life, and now you see, and I don't want to talk about the Chauvin thing too much, but it was almost like he just didn't want to listen to those people, and he was just trying to prove his point that he was right. Yeah. And I see that in a way smaller, like not so grand and not so terrible situations, a lot. So
yeah, you do see that. I mean, I do want to clarify for anyone who's listening. I mean, when people talk about defunding the police, that's just a terrible term. I don't know how.
Yeah, it's the worst
I don't know
word.
how. As someone who's trained to teach English and history, that's my academic background. I don't understand how that became the term that's being used. It's about moving resources to different areas. It's about redeploying those resources and reprioritizing. There doesn't necessarily have to be money taken away, but it needs to be spent in other ways to get better outcomes.
And that's something I see from a third party is kind of just like, I think defunding, again, disagree with that. I think it's almost the opposite in the way of like you talked about, is having someone either additional in the car or having someone who's trained in that aspect to de-escalate the situation, as opposed to, again, there are times obviously you have to use force, and that's just in the job, unfortunately. But having someone to de-escalate, like when Tony's wife Danny was in a few weeks ago, one thing she talked about, and we talked about the female perspective of a police officer, and how it is a little bit different when two females walk into a room of a heightened scenario. The ego drops a little bit, and then now that changes the room. So now if you're like what you're recommending, or having somebody who's educated and has that background and able to talk down some people who do have some kind of mental issues with that, that's a huge resource to have instead of eliminating all these other ones.
Right.
So, yeah.
All of this has to be explored, though, and I mean, I really appreciate that the conversation is happening. I'm sorry about the way it kind of came about or became front of the front page news, but I'm glad that conversation is occurring, because police officers that I know certainly express a lot of frustration with kind of, they love the job and all that, but they express kind of frustration with the way that they're expected to do things sometimes in terms of these populations, and it can be just very draining for sure.
Yeah.
And not that effective.
It's definitely got to be difficult. Like there's a lot of, for good reason, but there's a lot of things to do. And I know I've had conversations with Tony about situations where you're in a situation and you don't know what they're going to do. Right?
Sure.
So in that instance, it's like a big issue with media and how media portrays a lot of things. It's like you might not see the first 5 minutes of a situation that put a cop or someone in that situation to this heightened extent. And like Tony mentioned, that's another person in a uniform.
Yeah.
They can, as well as you're trained, if you walk into a difficult situation, you're a little bit scared too. And hopefully training takes over in the proper way. But I think a lot of people see one side or the other instead of taking that step back.
No, we've got to take a look at the nuances. But what I will say, not specific to Windsor and Essex County, is a lot of people of color, Indigenous people of African descent across Canada are very upset about some recent wellness checks gone terribly wrong, whether it was in New Brunswick, whether it was in Toronto, whether it was out west. And I mean, these seem to be hitting the news. I'm not sure whether they are hitting the news just because there's a greater focus on race right now. But it does lead people to ask questions about when this human being in the uniform approaches the situation, does he or she just inherently see certain people as more dangerous and more threatening than others? And I mean, those are things we have to explore as well.
I think we'd be crazy to say that they don't. But that's the whole soldier analogy. I was like, or like think like if somebody wants to bring this home to a situation, like if you got bit by a dog, you're going to be way less likely to put your hand out, right? So if you have fought with, somebody with mental health 5 times this month, you're going to be way quicker to fight,
Yeah.
And had you had negative interactions, a couple of shootings where the suspects were black, you're going to, I don't know how you would get that out of you without the decompression, without, maybe coming off the road. Maybe there should be a rotation out. Maybe that would like stop people from burning out and, allow you to see that there's, I don't know. I heard I guess it was a podcast that said, I wish we could just see people like we do for the color of their hair. Like, like you have brown hair, I have brown hair, you have blonde hair. And it doesn't matter. Rather, it's like, it's a black person, it's a white person, it's an Asian person. Like, I don't know how we can get there, but so when we talk, one of the things that I always was addressing a lot when I was working with the AKO Fram, and I coached there for years after, and a lot of the kids I coached would, being cop, they really wanted to ask me a lot of questions, and like wrongful arrests and profiling, that's always been like a real sensitive topic for me, because we're paid to prevent crime, and we can't, if you feel like you can't stop people, you know, if I stopped 10 cars and 9 had white people in them, and then the 10th is, and then it's, you're only stopping me because I'm black, or you're arresting me because I'm black. One of the things I was trying to get through to those youth was, please take, like, give the person the benefit of the doubt, that police officer, because most of us are not like that. It doesn't happen, I would think 100%, like I'd be naive to say it didn't, but give the person the benefit of the doubt and let them figure it out. And, you know, if you've done nothing wrong, do your best to cooperate, and I hope the interaction will be pleasant. What do you think about the whole profiling, and how do we allow police officers to do the job, but how do we prevent profiling? Education again, probably.
I think it is education to a large extent, but it's also, gosh, how can I put this? And again, I'm parsing my words very carefully, but I know that the majority of officers are great. I mean, I know officers, we all know officers. They're wonderful people. They're civil servants. They have a heart for service. They want to serve their community. It's beautiful. But there are those that are just in this for whatever reason. And unfortunately, people of color, racialized people, Indigenous people keep coming up against those. And it does, unfortunately, lead to stereotypes and judgment on our end in terms of, it does. In the same way, if you are a young male of African descent growing up on the West Side, and you've been stopped for what you know to be no real reason this many times over your growing up years, you know, from 15 to 25 or whatever, of course you have negative reactions. Like, that's obvious human behavior. So we have to be aware of that and not be too upset with people who are feeling fearful about police after they've been through those things. I mean, I think that, we all depend on police keeping our society safe and doing the necessary work to profile in some, to some extent. And if there's something suspicious, the same way we're all supposed to see something and say something, of course they have to do that too. And we rely on that. But there is an over-reliance on just, I'm sorry, I feel like grabbing the first person of African descent that you see if you hear that there's a non-white suspect out there. Let me give you an example that's from 1967 or 1980. Like, this happened in 2019. So there was, unfortunately, a young male of African descent who robbed a convenience store in Windsor, and we all heard about it because social media, and the description was pretty clear, and this person was pretty tall, and this person was pretty dark-skinned, and there was grainy footage, and there was all that stuff, and that was over on the west side of Windsor. Meanwhile, a friend of mine, a very dear friend, who is a light-skinned, mixed race, 5'5" man of African descent, was coming out of a library on the east side with his arms full of history books he had just checked out, and the police stopped him. Like, that's not smart, keeping us safe kind of stuff. That's just garbage. So, I mean, that happens to too many people. We all have stories like that. There's none of us that doesn't have a dad, an uncle, a brother, a cousin, a friend that's been through that. And I mean, so while I agree that there's some level of profiling that has to happen to keep the streets safe, we've also got to examine the extent to which that kind of nonsense takes place. And it's not excusable. It just doesn't even make sense. It's a waste of time and resources.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. A waste of time and resources is the big one. And I think what a lot of cops do wrong, so if we went broader, a lot of times, like, people don't believe this to be the truth. When I was listening to the video on the YouTube video you did with the mayor, is that a lot of times the description is white guy in a t-shirt, black guy in a t-shirt.
Sure.
And, if it's 4 a.m. and there's nobody walking around, your description is black guy with a t-shirt, one of my tactics to diffuse the situation right away was like, hey brother, like, look kid, man, like, it says black guy with a t-shirt, it's 4 a.m, you're the only one walking around 3 blocks from where this happened. Mm-hmm. And I think that immediately disarms the person you're speaking to. Like, legitimately I am stopping you because you're a black guy in a t-shirt.
Yeah.
I don't have anything else to go on, so let's just make sure you're good and, and you're out of here.
Yeah.
Or, maybe you are more involved and we need to investigate this more.
Right.
And I think, like, it's sometimes tiptoeing. Like, instead of us doing these conversations, like, tiptoeing in the real life out on the street is the worst way to do it. Like, just say what you think and say what's happening. And I think, like, a normal person will like appreciate that.
Yes.
Yes, you think?
I agree that if officers generally approached people in that manner, I don't think there would be that many problems in terms of just the way the community perceives this. Unfortunately, that's not the tone that's often taken.
Yeah, I know, and I hope that I hope that that's what's going to come of this. Like, I hope it's not going to be the police officers are going to stop doing what they should be doing.
Right.
It should be stop doing what you shouldn't be doing and then do what you should be doing better. And I hope that's what somebody listening to hear, because like you could be the best cop in the world. Like, I don't think if we had all the best cops and all the best training, there still would not be wrongful deaths.
Of course.
Because it's stuff that we're doing, it's stuff that they're doing in a split second. It's just, you need to realize that every day you can get better at this job, and maybe, there's just listening or just like talking instead of talking down, talking with people will get you a lot further and generally gets you immersed in the community and helps you find you more bad guys, because that's when the person's going to come up like, hey, yeah, it's not me, but I know a guy, like, and that leads you to more, and it benefits everybody in society.
And is there communication on both sides of like an altercation like that? And one thing, this is where I have questions about, because I definitely am naive to these situations, because like you mentioned before, if you're an innocent person and time after time you're getting wrongfully pulled over, there's a level that is eventually you're going to get fed up with it.
Yeah,
right?
over.
So my question is, in interactions like that, is it like wrong to just say, if you just cooperate right away and you don't give them a hard time and you can have that conversation, does that make it a lot easier for you? Or is there points where it's like, it's just getting ridiculous and boiled over, and then now I'm going to be just kind of heightened towards you and annoyed with you, and then that just escalates a lot of these situations?
Oh, sure. I mean, I absolutely do believe that people's sense of being fed up sometimes leads to the escalation of these situations. But I also have to say, much like me in a classroom setting or an educational setting, I understand that I'm the person with the training, the authority, and the maturity, and I'm not necessarily going to respond at the level of the 19-year-old who's giving me trouble right now. Do you know what I mean?
That is, what you're saying. Keep going, please.
And so I feel like the burden is a little bit greater on me to make sense in a situation that's escalated, as opposed to, well, this person needs to be as clear-headed as me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's some of that, too. And I'm going to go there. I'm really sorry to anyone that I offend right now, but not that sorry. Let's take a look at the Arby's incident, for example. We have two minimum wage earning teenagers who took it upon themselves to engage in a form of protest that may or may not have been appropriate in that situation. The police officer asked for his money back for his food, and that's fine. And then took a picture of them. I'm not sure that was so fine. It gets sent out to other people, and somehow it hits the social media. Their faces aren't blurred. These kids are like so easy to identify. Everybody knows where they work. So there's just a level of who's responsible for being the mature person in that situation. Do we expect the same treatment and behavior from a couple of teenagers at Arby's that we expect from ourselves as professionals with training, with all of this extensive background, all these de-escalation techniques that we've learned as educators or as police officers? Like, what are the expectations of ourselves? And so I would just ask, just using that example, when there are incidents in which a young person of African descent has been stopped too many times and they start to mouth off, like, does the officer need to react in a certain way, based on how they're being spoken to all the time? I feel as though, there are two humans in that situation, but one of them has a much better platform for, the best possible behavior under the circumstances.
One gets paid to do that.
Well paid.
In Canada, yes, well paid. And that is why there is the Police Act above and beyond the criminal code. Like, police officers are expected to act, and should be expected to act in a higher fashion, as an educator should be. I mean, even in this gym, if you responded to an unhappy member, in that, like, who was unhappy with you, if you responded in a negative way, there'd be repercussions here. Like, and I think that's where it comes down to, like, culture of things need to change, and culture of things need to be improved. And I think it is happening. I hope it's happening. I think this will fast forward it. If people can do this and, like, have these conversations instead of, like, you could have taken the stance when I presented some of these things with you of, like, no, like that's the way it is, or I could have and done the same. And I think that's what we need to realize, like, hey, there's stuff happening, and like the Black Lives Matter. I heard there was a video at Shannon Sharp, the football player. So like he's like, we're not saying all lives don't matter. We're saying like if you were a fireman like you and you showed up to a house and there's 10 houses and one's burning, you go to the burning house first, and that's what the Black Lives Matter is kind of happening. It's not. We're not saying that the rest of us don't matter, the police don't matter. I think, and I think that's where the line keeps getting drawn, and it shouldn't be, because like that's not the focus. Like, let's take advantage of the death of somebody and make it better. Right? Like, I think we can.
Yeah, I mean, I look at that as a martyrdom in that the George Floyd death, I actually look at it as a martyrdom in that it did open up conversations. I'm so sorry that it happened to that gentleman. I'm sorry about the way it happened. We all are.
Yes.
But it has opened up conversations that needed to happen and that were probably long overdue. And some of the anger that we see from protesters, most of whom are very peaceful in their protests, but some of the anger that we see boiling over is just, decades of frustration, and, that's to be expected. I do have to just say, to follow up on your question a few moments ago, though, everybody does have conversations with young people of African descent. And by everybody, I mean everyone in their lives of an adult nature has conversations about how to avoid getting into an escalated situation. And it's funny because white Canadian friends of mine have said things like, have you heard of this, the talk? And I'm like laughing, like, yeah, we all got that talk. Do you know what I mean? And we all give that talk to our nephews and our cousins. And I'm sorry that has to happen, but
that's crazy.
You want to keep people alive. And that there are sometimes individuals out there who will overreact while wearing the uniform. Right. So, we have to be safe.
Absolutely, and I think the police department, and there's no cop listening who won't fucking agree with me here, is that we hire. They work hard to hire these people. They do their best. I believe, and I don't think it's the hiring system that's the problem as much as it is the next phase of that system.
Yeah,
because there's times when you see these guys and girls, mostly guys, and you're like, he's not right. Like he should not be one of us. And like, I think people believe that we all like each other. We don't. Like, you go to back up another police officer if his life's in jeopardy. But there's a lot of cops I didn't like, and there's probably a lot of cops listening that don't like, or they won't be listening. But there's a lot of cops that don't like me, right? It's a workplace. And there's people there that really like don't belong, and not because they're anything other than a shitty person. And we need people who just want to continue. And once they identify those, I think whatever's the holdup, whether it's like worried about civil action or whatever that is, I think you just need to do what's right, and let's take that on the chin and pay your insurance off or whatever your lawsuit's going to be, and get rid of these people instead of letting them fester and then letting them have the burden of 20 years on top of that bad attitude. And like, we can make a difference.
But I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah, bring it.
I mean, and it's not pertinent to anything that has happened here in such an alarming way, but in that George Floyd situation, for example, he's not the only cop there. So what was going through the minds of those other people, do you think, just based on...
I didn't. So one thing, I didn't look into the backgrounds of the other officers, so everything I've heard is only hearsay, I guess, and I don't know what's true, what's not. But one is leadership, and I said that to Casey before I even saw the video. So I didn't know the magnitude of the video, and the first time I talked about it on this podcast, we actually cut it out because it was like, I was like, oh my God, I never seen anything like this. Because I know that in the heat of the moment, I have had to, and I've had to have people do it to me. Like, it is hard to fight a grown man. And I think like people watch a video and you're like, oh, there's 4 cops, 1 guy. Well, it does. It would take 4 cops to get my wife down. Like, so, and then you're just so fired up, and if people are yelling at you, somebody needs to come over and tap you on the back or shake you out. Smitty, hey, roll him on his side. Because we know now, like, as far as I know, George Floyd didn't die of strangulation. He died from asphyxiation, right? Which is the weight on his back compressed. And we know, police officers now, they didn't 10 years ago, or no, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they didn't know that was something that happened. And you could do that 100 times to George Floyd, and it might not happen again.
Right.
However, we know what happens, and you got to, once you have the situation under control, you might end up with a knee on the neck. It's probably not what you're trying to do. In the States, they teach things differently. Like, the chokehold doesn't exist here. It's not something we teach, but if you're in desperation, it might end up there. And you need to get somebody on their side, and the other cops need to do that job for them. Like, that's where leadership has to step in, and I think one thing, and I was probably guilty of it at the police service, is like seniority is a big thing. And if you're a junior guy, he's a senior guy, and he's had a lot of things under his belt, whether they're good or they're bad, you're going to be way more reluctant to grab that guy and shake him out of that mental, just, you're seeing blinders, and and a lot of times you are seeing red, man. Somebody just like, it doesn't appear in this case, but in the real life, somebody just tried to kill me. And yeah, of course I'm angry. I'm not that professional, but you need to like get it back down, get your breathing, look around, break tunnel vision, even have, there's times where cops have come and, or I've done it for people, is like, hey, go wait in the car. We'll take him from here. Because he did just try to like hurt you badly, and that's something you're going to take personally, and it's very hard not to. So good cops are coming to help the other good cops get them out of the situation, not to get them out of trouble, to stop them from getting into trouble, because you don't want the human to take over and throw an extra punch in the face because you're so mad. Right. Like that's things I think we don't tell people, and it needs to be known. Those other cops, I mean, guilty as far as I'm concerned. Like, you have to do your job. I don't think anybody would be as dumb to want to sit there for 9 minutes and let the man die. But it happened, and you should know, as far as you're trained, that it can't happen. So that's my opinion.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, my honest opinion. And like, the cops listening, if you are listening, please like snap your friends out of it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's happened. It's the less trained you are, the more it'll happen. The less experienced there are, the more it'll happen. But the more experienced, maybe the anger happens a little bit more, because you've been there and you've been exposed for too long.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned there with like, this is where a lot of people, like, you don't have to be the head of the team to be the leader in a situation like that. Like what Tony talks about is like, you're a team of 4, or whether you come in there, yes, this is a senior officer, but if you suspect something's off or you're going back, give him the tap, or if you can, like step up to that. And then maybe it is a protocol that you're unaware of. You're going to learn that in that second, but that tap might be enough for them to be like, kind of shake out of that situation where, whatever's going through their mind. Because like you meant, you get in a fight or you get in any intense situation, you're heightened.
Sure.
It doesn't really matter. Like, obviously highly, highly trained people, it's a bit different, but still you're in a high stress situation. It's tough to think clearly, right?
I don't think in this one, I want to make that known, is like this one, and I've said this to you so many times, I'll make sure I get this on air, is like 9 minutes doesn't make sense.
No.
Like 30 seconds.
This one's
2 minutes, especially if they're still fighting, or there wasn't like a heaps of crowds yelling from what I saw. Like, you can understand a couple of minutes, maybe 60 seconds, where you can't break that trance, but 9 minutes, you would think the trance should, I'm not the judge, I have no idea, but what was going through his head, and I don't think any of us do. That's what's so crazy about this one, is no police officer watches it and says like, oh, I think this is probably what was happening. Because like sometimes you see deaths and you're just like, oh my God, like that could easily happen to me. And then sometimes you see this and you're like, oh my God, like how did that ever happen? And that's so.
But it seems as though that individual, I don't want to make this all about that individual, but it seems as though he had sort of been moving along a spectrum of increasing difficulty with civilians over a period of time. There were a lot of complaints and nothing seems to have really happened. You don't know what the human resource record was, but he was still there.
Or perhaps the mental illness record. Like there might be something else. I don't know. Man, like if he was in a couple of shootings before, I know from my own, dealing with the PTSD and going to a psychologist and stuff, like, man, like if you don't treat that stuff, what's happening? And that's why I think the decompression, I have no idea if that would have solved this thing, and this is not about him, but like going forward, we need to like make sure no cops turn out like him.
Yes.
So like how do we do that, and how do we make sure? Because there's a reason I'm not there anymore. And if it was a great place to work, I would still probably be there. And it's not because there's not, I really believe that police officers, firemen, paramedics, teachers, they all go in it because they want to help. They started this like gem of a person that wants to help, and at a certain point becomes so jaded or calloused that, so we need to like really focus on that, and I think that will lower the negative interactions.
So within the system, we need some means, better means to address those things as they become evident. And I'm not sure to what extent that happens, organization by organization, but that seems to be something that needs to be looked at, right?
Absolutely.
And that comes, comes kind of with, keep going back to it, but the education and broadening these spectrums. Like I know in my experiences with fire, there are a lot of resources for decompression. You go to an accident or you see things that aren't normal to see. You have the availability to these resources, but that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to take them. Right? And it still exists, that kind of macho mentality a bit, as I can handle it, and things boil over. Right? And so having like the decompression side of things, like it's like if you were in a car accident today and tomorrow you have to wake up and drive 200 miles to go to work, you're going to be nervous getting into that car. So being in a heightened situation in another state or with an individual, now being faced with an individual the next day with that, it might bring some perspective as kind of how you will react to that, right? And it's like two different scenarios, but still the same kind of physical reaction, and you don't know how you're going to feel. Maybe you'll be fine getting in that car tomorrow, but maybe the complete opposite. So I think, just educating and being honest with how your mind works and how you feel about situations, I think is difficult to do, but I think what more people have to think about.
So since you are an educator, could you educate me on something? Because this is the words that keep coming up, and like, I don't know that white people, black people, I don't know any of us really understand it. Systemic racism and systematic racism.
Okay.
I don't get it. Like I lived it. I see it, like going into neighborhoods and understanding that like all these people are living in this shitty housing where they are fighting to make ends meet. Like, how did this happen? And that's kind of what this is, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, think of systematic racism in terms of behavior that gets repeated. So it may be a single individual or a single organization that continues to perpetrate racist acts or racist decisions against people of a certain group. That would be an example. But I mean, systemic racism is deep. It lives in the structures of how these organizations were formed and how they carry out their work all the time. And it's often society-wide. If we were to talk about systemic racism in the education system, for example, I would be telling you about stats, school board by school board, about how things occur to young kids of color. It's not just about the Greater Essex County District School Board. It's not just about the Peel District School Board. It's something that's embedded in the system. We can look at that in terms of the criminal justice system across this country. We can look at it in terms of access to employment across this country. It's not just that TD Bank's not hiring you. It's that, that all of these organizations have structures built in place that make it harder for a person from a certain background or a certain demographic to attain the same kind of opportunities that someone else with equivalent experience or expertise would have. So, when we're talking about dismantling systemic racism, it's a big problem, and it really requires daily acts of courage and daily acts of examining everything on everybody's part. It's not something that a single group in a single city can really chip away at. It's something that we're probably going to need to work in partnership with governments and just changing the culture to achieve. Is that helping?
Yeah, no, for sure it does. It does. And so, I don't know, that's what I'm trying to wrap my head around. So 13 officers out of 600. I think that's a pretty close stat still. I know that's a few years old, that stat, but it's, what is it, 17 maybe now, or 12? I don't know. A few quit, actually.
Yes,
a few
that's
quit
true.
With me. A few of my good friends. How do we fix that? So I talk about the tactical team. So when I was on the tactical team, the first, we had two black guys, but the first black guy ever to get on that team, I don't know if he was the first to try it, I have no idea, but the first one to get on that team, I mean, he got on not because he was black, because he was the best guy for that job. And I know he wouldn't have wanted it, I don't think. So how do we how does that work? Are we able, if you're hiring, how do we hire and make sure that it's the best person but it's fair? I don't know, how does that?
I'm going to try to tackle that a couple of different ways. I mean, one of it is in terms of the outreach. Some of it is going out and finding the best candidates. But that's also overcoming some cultural assumptions that people of color have about policing as well, and about the people that work in policing.
Yeah, they don't want to hang out with me, probably, right? In a lot of cases.
If I am a 26-year-old young man who has graduated from university and has a heart for public service and has all of the attributes that would make a great police officer, but I've had all these run-ins and negative interactions, why the hell do I want to spend my years with all of y'all. Like, so we
Yeah,
have
no,
to
I
look
get
at that
it. I
too.
get it.
But then, unfortunately, there's another barrier in place, and it's in terms of the background checks. And it was interesting because this has been talked about in our community for a while, and it was interesting to hear the chief confirm it the other day. But if someone, I'm not necessarily using the right terminology because I'm not in law enforcement, but if someone has had a bunch of stops, each of those is kind of a ping in the database.
Oh, yeah, I never
Right.
thought about this.
And
yeah.
so you may not have actually committed a crime. You may not have been charged with anything. You may not have ever been arrested, but you've been stopped 9 times walking around on the west side. It's actually going to reduce your score, right? So it's harder for people in certain neighborhoods, in certain demographic groups with certain experiences
something
to
I never thought
even
of.
get their foot in the door. Like
So
they're
whether-
disqualified.
So whether or not you were doing anything wrong, like basically every time your license is scanned,
well, even
that
not your
is-
license, you can just be on foot, right?
and
Yeah,
it's
you can-
just put in as kind of like a
It's if the
a
officer
check.
puts that in as a stop, so like into their information, and I don't know the policies anymore, but like I would tell you, like there's and it happens to white people too, and it was one of the unfortunate things. Like it's a bad part of policing that kind of needs to be fixed. Is like for me, for example, so if my background check, I told you I played football, right? So if I there was guys in that locker room that got in trouble, man. So if I got stopped, whether they're white or black, with me, and they've been somebody in trouble, if a police officer took the time, and I might have just been out like having a beer after football, no idea what this guy does in his other,
Yeah.
right? I get stopped, and then I get put in association with Casey Wright, who's a known drug dealer, gun dealer. Mm-hmm. And now me, who's never been in trouble, I got associated to that. Background check comes in, and there it is. And you talk about the Stag being such a great place. 2 kids could come out of there, 2 kids of color come out of there, or white kids really, but like this is about racism. And they come out, they get stopped. One has an extensive record, and one does not. But now a report goes in saying associate of. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe they're just sitting there shooting hoops. Like they might be friends, but it also doesn't make both guilty. And that's like where that's a lot of these things really came from. And the profiling with Toronto was one of the biggest problems. Was it was part of their promotional process. Mm-hmm. Like it got them points for stopping people.
Yes.
And obviously going into neighborhoods that are densely populated.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been to Toronto, the Jane and Finch or the Dixie projects, densely populated with foot traffic.
Mm-hmm.
Man, it's like you could stop people every 2 seconds and like get a point because you're getting information, right? And
Sure.
and you could at any point as a police officer, I could find a way to associate you to crime.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because I know that this is a crime-ridden block, or you came from a house where a known criminal activity, and it's not necessarily a lie. It's just maybe poor judgment of now not understanding the full. Like you said, like I've never even thought of that, like the police background check of just getting stopped and understanding the full circle, like of what you're doing, and maybe even not going so far as even being a police officer, just coaching sports. You
Yeah.
go to get your background check, and they're like, "Oh, you hang out with so and so." Like,
Yes,
what? No,
your vulnerable sector clearance. I mean, these are things that nobody's thinking about necessarily when they're doing them. But that kid that grows up, at Jane and Finch or whatever, is probably, if they have the other attributes that would make a great officer, an ideal officer. They come from the community. They know how it works. Like that's fantastic.
Cops. The best cops are the guys who can communicate and know what's happening.
Of course, but this person is now disqualified.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's got to change. There are some things that I think are conversations, but I think that's just got to change. I don't think that makes any sense in this day and age, and it's really keeping people out that should be considered.
So that's where like kind of the systemic burden lies with that, is like if you're kind of raised and born in those neighborhoods to no fault of your own, you're automatically,
I mean, unless you've just never
In a-
had a police interaction, but
right.
what are the chances?
But you're now fighting your way out of a bit of a hole, and that's where, that's that stuff
You're
like
already in a hole from the oppression and
Yeah.
leading into that.
and that stuff like someone like myself, I don't relate to and can't relate to, and that's where I don't know, it's opening my eyes more and more, is hearing more of these facts and more in-depth ideas behind it. It makes a lot of sense.
So Irene, this conversation's been awesome so far. One thing I want, the garage gym versus nobody, something that we do here, and it's how we support the community. We're hugely involved in the charity. We have now grown, not us, but we've grown almost like a committee of gyms that are now like really contributing like hugely to charity work and stuff like that. can we in some way, could we help like with maybe co-ops, or is there something we can do like specifically towards, like it doesn't have to just be people of color or all minorities, like yes, which I guess would be people of color. There I am again being like ignorant, not knowing what I'm saying, but let's say non-white people. Is there something we can do to get involved in that manner? Like we have a network of people that would be more than willing to help. And
yeah, I think that would be a great opportunity for more dialogue. I mean, there are some wonderful organizations that help Black kids or kids of color, kids from racialized backgrounds.
There we go.
You know, some that I like to use synonyms so people know they have options. Some in Windsor, for example, are the Coalition for Justice, Unity, and Equity. They do great work with kids. The Black Canadians for Educational and Economic Progress do excellent work with young people. Sandwich Teen Action Group does great work with young people. And I mean, here in Amherstburg, there's the Amherstburg Freedom Institute. Everything's kind of shut down with them right now. But once, you know, museums are back up and running and things can happen again, they have a wonderful mentorship and leadership program for young kids from racialized backgrounds. So, I mean, those are just 4 examples that come immediately to mind of groups that you could partner with to maybe establish something that would enable kids from those backgrounds to come in and do something and maybe access some equipment or do some co-ops or get some job experience or whatever it might be. And that would take a lot of the burden off. I know that a lot of our kids who are athletically inclined, that's not a demographic I can relate to. I played sports only in gym as required, like under duress. But I would say, but I would say that, you know, the burden on them to maintain this excellence and to have access to trainers and stuff is kind of difficult if there's a low income situation. And that can actually be a barrier as well to them getting forward in terms of athletic scholarships and stuff. So I mean, think in terms of those opportunities and see what you can work out. I think that would be a great help.
Yeah, there's some people doing great things like Mahari. I actually coached Mahari.
Yes. Sorry that I forgot you, Mahari.
I'm real tight with Mahari. So I actually coached him when he was at AKO, and I mean the guy's doing incredible things for kids, and he's somebody that if you're looking to reach out to, and you know, if somebody listening here, we have a lot of really giving people we want to help. He's
Mahari, please charge that to my head and not my heart. I didn't mean to forget you.
All right, so I think lastly, let's just get away from this whole topic. Something that kind of came up in your guest form that surprises me and listening to you speak is you said you weren't always confident and standing in front of people, and like the way that I've now listened to you speak for this the 3rd or 4th time, clearly that's not an issue anymore, especially when you're talking about hot button topics and you're not like shying away whatsoever. How would somebody take action on that? Because I think that's a weakness in a ton of people.
Oh, for sure. I mean, they say public speaking is like something that people fear more than death, actually. So, I mean, yeah, I used to be very shy. And I mean, I am actually an introvert. And after this, I'm going to go and stay in my house for several consecutive hours and talk to no one. Like, that's literally what will happen. But I will say, if you want to get things done in this society, you have to be willing to communicate. And that increasingly takes the form of both writing and speaking. You know, you have to have a social media presence. You have to be able to write to people. You have to be able to speak confidently. And honestly, it's practice more than anything. It's forcing yourself to do it. Find some role models. Find some people you look up to. Watch what they do. Watch how they carry out their communication. Learn from them. Ask them questions. That's what I did, and it certainly helped a lot. And now I'm in a position of getting stuck in front of the camera an awful lot because I appear not to hate it as much as other people do.
That's why I reached out. That's fantastic. So if somebody wants to get a hold of you or to help you in any way, how can they do that?
You know what? I am very easy to find. Police officers, I'm very easy to find on social media. I'm just Irene Moore Davis on Facebook. I'm just Irene Moore Davis on Twitter. But also, if you want to reach out to my organization, I belong to several, but my main organization is the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. Our email address is ecbhrs@gmail.com, so we are super easy to find as well.
Casey will make sure
That's
that
great.
gets
It'll all be in the bottom.
And so yeah, I cannot thank you enough for coming in and for being open to having this discussion. And like the way the discussion went, I think was like, you know, we talk about it, just about the communication. I think like if you're going to educate anybody on how to like best stand up, it's to make sure you can be well heard. And so practice, everybody listening, just practice this communication, and hopefully things get a little bit better. And like we have a resource now that we can reach out to, and it was nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
That was great.
Cheers.
Very good. Cheers.
Cheers.